as if read.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Ohio.
Mr. President, I'd like to speak in morning business up to 20 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'd come to the floor today to support the Oil Spill Response Improvement Act of 2010. It's a bill that seeks to directly deal with one of the most serious issues facing our country today, the aftermath of the Deepwater Horizon incident, and how the federal government responds to what will likely turn out to be one of the worst ecological disasters that has taken place off our nation's shores. The bill is targeted and supports jobs in the Gulf Coast region, prevents our nation from relying further on foreign nations for our energy needs, and protects the American taxpayer from being placed on the hook should, God forbid, a future incident ever occur. And specifically, the bill gives the President the ability to raise caps on economic damages done by oil companies. It creates a Price-Anderson model, which all entities operating in the Gulf would share the risk, like what we do with 104 nuclear power plants. I don't think the public's aware of the fact that they all have the same insurance policy, and if something would go wrong with one nuclear power plant, all the other ones' insurance would be called upon, and there's no question about liability. They just take care of the problem. We need to do the same thing in terms of these oil rigs. It maintains the integrity of the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund. It provides states an additional funding system to be used to protect the ecosystem. It accelerates the lifting of the Deepwater moratorium in the Gulf of Mexico. It creates a bipartisan spill commission with subpoena power to investigate causes of the Deepwater Horizon explosion. These are good ideas that I think that will address the crisis at hand. They're good ideas that will help get people back to work in the Gulf. I know that Senator Reid has proposed an alternative piece of legislation. I understand it maintains the current moratorium on deepwater drilling off the outer continental shelf, creates a liability regime that would likely limit production in the Gulf of Mexico to only the largest of oil companies, and that it raids the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund to pay for untested efficiency programs. Now, I welcome a robust debate, but looking at the schedule next week, my understanding is that the majority leader will likely fill the tree and not allow any amendments. So what we're probably going to see is a Republican-Democrat side-by-side taken care of in one day. Now, to be candid, this is a much too serious issue to cram into one day with just side-by-side proposals. And I think it gives rise to those watching what we're doing here in the Senate with some feeling that what we're doing here is not genuine and disingenuous, and that, quite frankly, if we do this next week, I think what it will do is further cause the public to think less of the institution of the United States Senate. And regardless of whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, you ought to be concerned about the fact that since polling has been done of approval of the United States Senate, the numbers today are the worst that we've ever seen. So something's going on out there, and they're watching what we're doing, and they're saying, these people seem to be more interested in partisan politics or who's going to win the next election in terms of how many new senators, or in the House of Representatives, who's going to control the Senate or the House, instead of really looking at the problems confronting our country and saying, can't you people work together on a bipartisan basis to solve the problems that we have? The fear and the uncertainty today in this country, I have never seen anything like it. And I think all of us should be concerned about how the people in this country feel about what we're doing here. Whether you are a Democrat or a Republican, environmental advocate, oil industry employee, I think all should agree that Congress needs to respond intelligently to the situation with action that balances environmental risks with our nation's energy requirements. Much of the responsibility for this spill should lie on the shoulders of a few bad actors in the private sector, and they're primarily with BP. And I have to say that from my looking at this, there's gross negligence. It's just amazing what they knew about and didn't do, and I think that will come out. Although I imagine there's going to be enough blame to go around once we've had a chance to step back and see just what happened. The most important thing is that the decisions this administration has made, not only in reacting to the spill, but also in its general attitude towards domestic oil and gas production, I think have been disastrous for the Gulf region. Last year I sat down in my office with Secretary Ken Salazar to talk about domestic oil and gas production and our nation's energy strategy. And in that meeting, I conveyed to him that I've always believed that one of the most pressing challenges America faces today is reducing our reliance on foreign sources of energy. I called it the Second Declaration of Independence, finding more oil and using less. I told Secretary Salazar that I was concerned about the administration's actions that were limiting energy production in the United States. He had disagreed with me. Secretary Salazar said the department was in the process of restructuring and undergoing a thorough review to ensure that proper oversight of the oil and gas industry was being provided. He pointed out the department was moving forward with lease sales in the Atlantic, and that, in his opinion, things were just fine. I took him at his word and waited, but didn't see any change in the department's attitude. I sent a letter to the Secretary on April 19th, 2010, reiterating my concern that his department was ignoring its obligations to oversee domestic oil and gas development and focusing too much of its attention on resources on renewed efforts to promote renewable energy projects that made good photo ops, but that would have little effect in meeting our nation's long-term energy needs. I expressed further concern that efforts to lease areas of the outer continental shelf for oil and gas production were being restricted. For example, in November of 2009, the Department of Interior acted to shorten the lease terms for a specific sale of leases in the Gulf of Mexico. The shortening of the lease terms will likely do nothing to guarantee more discoveries, but rather serves to increase risk as companies are rushed to complete production before the expiration of their lease. 3 months later, I have yet to receive an answer to my letter. And this is particularly disappointing to me because I consider Secretary Salazar a former colleague, a friend, and I've always respected him. And Mr. President, I would like to insert in the congressional record the letter that I sent to Secretary Salazar.
Without objection.
Meanwhile, the Gulf of Mexico is now under a revised moratorium on deep-water offshore drilling, imposed by President Obama and the Department of Interior. This moratorium jeopardizes 30% of this nation's domestic oil production and 13% of our natural gas production. 33 drilling platforms are currently idled in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, that doesn't sound like a large number, but keep in mind that these rigs are really the size of factories. Each platform supports as many as 1,400 direct and indirect jobs, which means as many as 46,200 jobs could be lost in the short term because of this moratorium. As these good-paying jobs, this could amount to as much as $10 million in lost wages per month per platform. Further, the moratorium threatens the livelihood of more than 300,000 oil and gas workers in the region. The loss of revenue will be in the billions. A 6-month moratorium could result in a $147 billion loss in local, state, and federal revenue over the next 10 years. Oil and gas production in the Gulf of Mexico is a significant revenue stream for the federal government. A moratorium on production that lasts 6 months could cost the federal government between $120 million and $150 in lost royalties and $300 million to $500 million decline in government revenue in just 2011. That's next year. Now, this is sure to have a devastating effect on our nation's long-term national security. I've said over and over again that Americans are hurting from our addiction to oil. I'm not sure they fully realize the extent of our national security, and indeed our very way of life is threatened by our reliance on foreign oil. Every year we send billions of dollars overseas for oil to pad the coffers of many nations that do not have our best interest at heart, like Venezuela, whose leader has threatened to cut off his oil exports. Today, over 80% of the world's oil reserves are in the hands of governments and their respective national oil companies. 16 of the world's 20 largest oil companies are state-owned. Russia has proven that it has no qualms with using energy as a weapon. In Venezuela, Hugo Chavez has forcefully consolidated the nation's vast oil reserves under the control of their state-owned oil company. He frequently uses the company as a political leverage in his region. Now, with the rise in national oil companies around the world and the apparent weaponization of the globe's energy resources, U.S. domestic oil production has been on a decline. We now import nearly 60% of our oil. And as a consequence, we're sending billions of dollars overseas and putting our fate in the hands of regimes that do not have our best interest at heart. For example, in 2007, we spent $327 billion to import crude oil and refined petroleum products. In 2008, the amount we shipped overseas spiked to more than $700 billion. In other words, we take American money and send it overseas. And 55% of that money, or nearly $400 billion, went to oil-exporting OPEC nations. Today, oil amounts for over half our trade deficit. And our dependence on foreign oil is even made more troubling when you consider our nation's financial situation. The national debt stands at $13.3 trillion, more than double the $5.6 trillion that existed when I came to the Senate in 1999. By the end of 2010, the national debt is expected to have grown to over $14 billion. Last year, we borrowed $1.4 trillion. And I don't even use the words anymore, to GDP, the percent of GDP. The best way I can explain the soup that we're in is that last year, for every dollar the federal government spent, we borrowed 41 cents. And most people, when I tell them that, they just can't believe it. But that's the situation. And this year, we're going to borrow $1.5 trillion, or another year where we borrow 41 or 42 cents for every dollar we spent. And over half the privately owned national debt, this something people should be concerned about it. It's being held by foreign creditors, mostly foreign central banks. In fact, foreign creditors have provided more than 60% of the funds the U.S. Treasury has borrowed since 2001, according to the Department of Treasury. And who are the creditors? According to the Treasury Department, the three largest foreign holders of U.S. debt: China, Japan, and the OPEC nations. Now, these concerns led me to introduce the National Energy Security Act last year with Senator Byron Dorgan. The bill expands development of domestic oil and natural gas by streamlining the inventory and permitting of the most promising areas of the outer continental shelf. And by the way, the group that's supporting this are a group of former admirals and generals who basically said, we've got to do something because of the fact of too much reliance on foreign oil. We are in terrible shape. We are on thin ice in terms of our national security. In addition, the bill provides $50 billion in federal loan guarantee authority for low-carbon electricity, including nuclear and advanced coal. Promotes the electrification of the transportation fleet to reduce dependence on foreign oil, use less. Supports building the crucial infrastructure necessary to create a robust, reliable national grid. And strengthens electricity transmission, including giving FERC the power to site transmission lines. Americans today demand action, and they demand we come together in a bipartisan fashion to solve not only this crisis in the Gulf, but our larger energy crisis. For 10 years, I've been a member of the Environment and Public Works Committee, and for 10 years, I have tried to coax Congress into harmonizing our energy, our economy, and our environment. And Congress has refused, and now the chickens have come home to roost, and we're paying the price because we weren't able to get together. Mr. President, I believe that the best message that we can send the world is that we get it. We must demonstrate that we can safely and responsibly produce oil off our shores while also promising ourselves that we are going to use less by undertaking a renewed effort to make the United States of America the most oil-independent nation in the world. The most oil-independent nation in the world. And I envision in America, 10 years from now, where we can have enough oil to take care of our needs. I imagine in America that at least is the least reliant country in the world on oil. In America, where our economy is not threatened by our reliance on foreign energy sources. It will be an America that has created hundreds of thousands of jobs through responsible development of our nation's resources and through the creation of new industries in the field of alternative energy. Wouldn't it be great for our children and grandchildren to one day celebrate the time America put aside its differences and come together to announce what I refer to as the Second Declaration of Independence, define more and use less? I believe that with this attitude, we can rekindle the American spirit of self-reliance, innovation, and creativity to usher in a new era of prosperity. And the first step is to pass the Oil Spill Improvement Act to get people back to work in the Gulf and to give the Department of Interior the tools it needs to provide proper oversight of the oil and gas industry. And second, Congress needs to do its job. Make the passing of a comprehensive energy bill a priority and provide certainty as to how our nation will supply energy to its economy in the future. And again, I would iterate and call upon my colleagues, the majority leader, the minority leader, that for us next week to put out the Republican proposal and the Democratic proposal and to have back-to-back votes really will do nothing but increase the cynicism that's out there among the American people about what we're doing here in the United States Senate. Next week, we should finish up the small business bill, get on with that. We ought to get on with the consideration of the Kagan nomination by the President and come together and say, let's get serious. Let's work during the August break to try and see if we can't come together on a compromise between the two back-to-back bills so that maybe when we get back in September, we can have something that we can all agree on and get passed and reassure the American people that we're serious about dealing with their problems, and maybe even give consideration, I know this would be difficult, but to look at what many of us have suggested, and that is to look at the bill that Byron Dorgan and Lisa Murkowski put together that came out of the Energy Committee on a bipartisan basis. Perhaps look at a bill that Senator Rockefeller and I have worked on for over 2 years that deals with capturing and sequestering carbon, to look at a title that deals with nuclear energy that I've worked with Senator Lieberman and others, and get something done. It may not be satisfactory to some of the environmental groups that are out there. It may not be satisfactory to a lot of the business groups, but at least we'd move the ball down the field this year so that, again, people know that we're serious about less reliance on foreign sources of energy, and also genuinely concerned about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I've been, as I said, been around here 12th year on Environment and Public Works. For years, we wanted to do something about NOx, SOx, and carbon, bring down the caps. The environmental group said, no, we won't agree to that. We have to have 4 Ps, and we have to include greenhouse gas emissions. So we did nothing. So all that period of time, I'll never forget the Secretary of State when she was a senator from New York, and she wanted to compromise because the Adirondack Council and the folks from the Smoky Mountains agreed that if we did a 3 Ps, reduce NOx, SOx, and mercury, that we could move along. And the environmental groups came along, and they gave her the Villain of the Month award. Hillary Clinton gives the Villain of the Month award because she's trying to work on a compromise that'll move us down the road. So I just think that we have some time left. I know it's going to be difficult because we have the backdrop of the election facing us. I would hope that once that's over that we have a robust lame duck session so we can deal with some of the things that are on the minds of the American people. And hopefully, Mr. President, perhaps this commission that you and I wanted to see done on the floor of the Senate that the President finally had to do through executive session can come back here with some positive suggestions on how we can deal with our debt and these budgets that are not going to be balanced as far as the eye can see. I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.